Oh man, I know you guys are super pumped up to learn about some special kinds of parallelograms. I bet that you did not know that there are other shapes that are also considered to be parallelograms. So rectangles, rhombi, and squares. Rhombi is rhombus, plural, by the way. But anyway, so rectangle, rhombus, and square, these shapes are also parallelograms. Because guess what? They have opposite sides that are parallel, which makes them a parallelogram, which is pretty cool. So all these shapes have double identities. They're a rectangle, but they're also a parallelogram. Or they're a rhombus, but they're also a parallelogram. Or they're a square, or they're also a parallelogram. So it's pretty cool. Some shapes have several identities, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. So let's talk specifically about what makes a rectangle a distinct parallelogram. So a rectangle is a parallelogram with four right angles. Okay, so if you see a parallelogram and it has four right angles, it makes it a rectangle, which is pretty cool. A rhombus is a parallelogram that has four congruent sides. So if you ever just see, a parallelogram strolling down the street and it has four congruent sides, guess what? It's a rhombus. All right, and then finally, a square is a parallelogram that has four right angles and four congruent sides. So it kind of combines what it says about rectangle and rhombus. So let's think about it. Is a square a rectangle? Okay, well, what makes something a rectangle is that it has four right angles. Does a square have four right angles? Yes, it does. So a square is not only a parallelogram, it's also a rectangle. Holy hot dog, right? And also a square has four congruent sides. What parallelogram has four congruent sides? You guys are so smart. It is a rhombus. So a square, since it's a parallelogram with four congruent sides, is also a rhombus, which is mind-blowing. A square has four identities. It's a square, a rhombus, a rectangle, and a parallelogram. Holy hot dog. So when you say square, you're also secretly saying rhombus, rectangle, and parallelogram, which is pretty cool. And that is why a square is basically my favorite quadrilateral ever, because it has so many identities. So the square is the best kind of quadrilateral there is, in my opinion. But anyways, let's talk about some properties and some theorems about each of these distinct parallelograms. So we know a rectangle is a parallelogram with four right angles. Here are some theorems about rectangles that might come in handy. So if a quadrilateral is a rectangle, then it has to be a parallelogram because we already know that a rectangle is a special kind of parallelogram. Okay, so a rectangle is always a parallelogram, but is a parallelogram always a rectangle? That's something you need to chew on. All right, number two, if a parallelogram is a rectangle, then the diagonals are congruent. So that will lead into our properties. All right, so for a rectangle, since a rectangle is a parallelogram, that means it has all the properties of a parallelogram. So when you solve things involving rectangles, or when you solve problems with rectangles, you also have to keep in mind all the properties of parallelograms because they apply to the rectangle. So opposite sides are still congruent. Opposite angles are still congruent. Opposite sides are still parallel. Diagonals still bisect each other. And same-side interior angles are still supplementary. So you have to keep all five of those things in your noggin as well as these additional properties when you're solving things about rectangles. So a rectangle has to have four right angles because that's a part of the definition. And in this case, the diagonals are actually congruent. So one diagonal's length is the same length as the other diagonal, which means that every piece of the diagonal is congruent. Okay, because if this is the midpoint and the whole diagonal is congruent to the other whole diagonal, that means that every single piece is congruent. So those are some additional properties about rectangles. Holy hot dog, I bet you didn't know all this nifty information about rectangles. All right, so now let's talk about a rhombus, which we already know it's a parallelogram with four congruent sides. So let's talk about some theorems pertaining to a rhombus. So if a quadrilateral is a rhombus, then it's a parallelogram because we already know that it's one of the special cases. Okay, and opposite sides are parallel. If a parallelogram is a rhombus, then its diagonals are perpendicular. What does it mean to be perpendicular? You guys are so smart. Perpendicular means that when two lines intersect, they form a right angle or 90-degree angle. And a third theorem is if a parallelogram is a rhombus, then the diagonals bisect a pair of opposite angles. So when that diagonal hits the angle on the rhombus, it will bisect it or cut it in half. Okay, so that will lead into our properties of a rhombus, which, holy hot dog, there's a lot of stuff going on with a rhombus. A rhombus is a pretty nifty figure, in my opinion. So since a rhombus is a parallelogram, that means it has all the properties of a parallelogram. So you have to keep those items in mind that I talked about on the previous slide. Also, your diagonals are perpendicular, so when they intersect, they form four 90-degree angles. The diagonals bisect opposite angles. So if you see here, you guys, one pair of angles, when the diagonal hits it, bam, it cuts it in half and makes two congruent angles. So it'll do it on every single angle. So it does it on this side, this side, this side, and this side. So it's bisecting angles all day long. It's bisecting these, and these. Holy hot dog, right? All right, and then finally, a rhombus has four congruent sides as well, because that is your definition of a rhombus. So a rhombus has a lot going on. You got to remember a lot about a rhombus when you solve a rhombus problem, which unfortunately, you just have to memorize the stuff. There's no other way to do it. All right, and then finally, a square is a parallelogram with four right angles, which also makes it a rectangle, and four congruent sides, which also makes it a rhombus. Okay, so let's just move on to some properties. A square doesn't have any special theorems. So since a square is a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus, guess what? We combine all the properties of every single shape. Okay, so you have to keep in mind everything about a parallelogram when you solve a square, everything about a rectangle when you solve for a square, and everything about a rhombus when you solve for a square. So you really have to have a lot on your mind when you're solving problems pertaining to squares. All right, so now we're going to work some example problems. Example 1 and 2, we're going to be solving using properties of a rhombus in example 1 and properties of a rectangle in example 2. So go ahead and pause the video and watch example 1 and 2. Example 3, you will be solving using properties of a square, which is going to be fun. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and start solving, cannot talk today. Go ahead and pause the video and watch how you solve things using a square. And guess what, you guys? That's it.